Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this local government briefing on Plan for Victoria, State Government's first community-led strategic land use plan for all of the state. My name is Jessie Wright, and my role is Executive Director, Strategic Planning at the Department of Transport and Planning. This session is being recorded and will be available along with the slides presented today, so please feel free to share with colleagues who are unable to attend. The chat function is available for people to post questions, and we will do our best to reply to these as they come in. But everyone knows through Teams that can be quite tricky depending on our numbers. So failing what we do not answer today, we will follow up after, but we'll do our best. We did ask people to send through any questions that they might have in advance of today, and thank you to those that did. So that has helped us to tailor the presentation, and we will send out responses for all questions that we received. As I mentioned just before, for those who are at the start, we have around 480 people who have registered to attend today from councils across Victoria, and we want to thank everybody for joining us and taking the time out of your day. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all joining in from today, which I imagine is quite varied across the state. For me, this is the Wurundjeri Wurrung peoples, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Peoples who are on the call today. I am joined by our team. We've got Lester Townsend, Director Plan Victoria, and Sam Sweetman, Manager Plan Victoria, who will also be presenting with me today. They will take you through an overview of the engagement, of what we heard from councils, an overview of what's in the plan, the vision, the pillars, the actions, and outline initial implementation work that we are doing for Plan Victoria, and touch on future sessions we've got around the housing target implementation. But firstly, I'll provide a recap of the plan. So Plan for Victoria, as many of you would know, is a commitment from government's housing statement, which was released in late 2023, and is a response to Victoria undergoing significant population growth, with housing becoming increasingly unaffordable, as we know, and the need to plan for our future. The plan is our strategy to ensure housing supply keeps pace with demand, and state government has set an ambitious target of 2.24 million new homes by 2051. Over the next decade, 800,000 homes are expected to be delivered. This plan does replace the previous Plan Melbourne and the regional growth plans as a statewide strategy to guide long-term growth and set a vision for Victoria. A key focus of the plan is on delivering housing close to transport, jobs and essential services to enhance our livability and sustainability. 30% of new homes will be in greenfield areas, ensuring a balance between urban and suburban expansion, and the establishment of local government housing targets to ensure all areas contribute to housing supply is a backbone of the plan. A lot has occurred over the past 15 months following the release of the housing statement. We've got a bit of a timeline here. We kicked off initial industry and council engagement on the plan in December 23 to introduce the project, acknowledge the role industry and local government will play in driving the actions for Victoria. Statewide community engagement commenced in early 24 to understand the future vision for Victoria from all Victorians. In May and June last year, you may remember DTP engaging with your council to discuss your approach, challenges and opportunities for housing in your municipality, as well as draft housing targets and early ideas testing for content for Plan for Victoria. The draft housing targets were released in June of last year, and in July we released the 8 big ideas for Victoria and associated actions for feedback. This was developed from over 9,000 pieces of feedback and more than 850 hours of conversations that we held with community, with councils and a range of stakeholders. We asked for feedback through a survey and formal submission process, which closed in September last year, and that feedback was used to inform the final development of the plan and the actions. On the last day of February, so nearly 3 weeks ago now, we released and launched Plan for Victoria. For the first time in Victoria, we have a community-led strategic land use plan for the state. It replaces Plan Melbourne, as I said, and the statewide regional growth plans, ensuring a more integrated and forward-looking approach. What the plan does, it establishes housing targets for every Victorian municipality, clearly identifying how many homes are needed and broadly where they should be built. Provides clear guidance for delivering homes near transport, jobs and essential services, and focuses on creating vibrant, livable and sustainable communities over the next 30 years. The Activity Centres program, which is another piece of work underway by DTP, with the list launched through P4V as well, supports housing targets by placing homes close to jobs, shops, transport and services in established areas, improving walkability, making our neighbourhoods more accessible and connected. A key element of this has been about really making sure we're putting homes in the right location, and that's not all greenfield, it's not all infill, it's not all regional, it's not metro, it's a balance. And Plan for Victoria is very much an action plan, which is quite different to what's happened in the past. It's more than a vision, it's clear and concise. It lays out the key steps needed to achieve our long-term goals for housing, transport and sustainable growth. Also, very importantly, is it's not a static document. It's a living plan that will evolve to meet the changing needs of Victorians. So what does this mean? It reflects what Victorians have told us in the large part that they want for their future and provides a clear roadmap for how we get there. It's about understanding. So we visited every part of the state, we met with people, we listened to communities and businesses and local governments, and it was backed by hundreds of hours of modelling to identify well-connected and well-serviced locations for new homes. There's the Imagine aspect in terms of setting a vision by Victorians for Victorians. A people's panel was created representing a diverse range of voices, and they developed a vision statement for the future of Victoria. This vision provides a long-term guide for government and future decision-making, ensuring planning aligns with community needs. It's about acting, turning vision into reality. It's about action. It's not just about what government will do, but how we all play a role. It calls on state government, local government, businesses and communities to work together to realise this vision. By taking a collaborative approach, we believe we can build a socially and economically strong, resilient and sustainable state. And it's about learning. This is where the living plan aspect comes in, implementation and monitoring. It's designed to adapt, to respond to new challenges and opportunities as they arise, to be updated with new actions as required. We will track progress, evaluate what's working and refine our approach over time. The plan includes a focus on short to medium and long-term outcomes. The commitment from government is to continually adjust and add new actions, ensuring the plan remains relevant and effective. Plan for Victoria is about delivering a future that reflects the voices of all Victorians. At this point, I would like to hand over to Sam Sweetman, our Manager Plan for Victoria, to take us through the engagement.
Thanks, Jessie, and good afternoon, everyone. Over the next few slides, I'll provide an overview of what we did as part of the engagement program, but also what we heard from councils. This was a significant engagement program, so we embarked on the largest public engagement process on a strategic plan that Victoria's ever seen. This engagement program reached over 110,000 Victorians, either through online engagement or in-person activities across the state. Jessie touched on a few of these engagement processes, but we had 4 key phases of engagement over the past sort of 15 months. Phase 1 was initial engagement with local councils and the industry to hear about understanding the vision for Victoria and testing early ideas for the plan. And this included council CEOs and mayors and probably a large number of council staff on the call today. So the main purpose of that session was to really introduce the plan and acknowledge the role that industry and councils will play in driving the vision and the actions of the plan once it is now developed. Phase 2 commenced statewide community engagement on the future vision of the plan. So a lot of online sort of interaction and activity around the future visioning for the state, introducing the pillars and getting people to understand what Plan for Victoria is and what Plan for Victoria is trying to do. This included a large number of sort of in-person pop-up events across shopping centres all over the state and in sort of key locations throughout Melbourne and regional Victoria as well. As Jessie mentioned, you probably are aware when DTP came and spoke to you about through one-on-one meetings and regional group discussions about housing in your council area, as well as local government housing targets as well as sort of early ideas for testing for development in the plan. And phase 3, which kicked off in July, was the release of the 8 big ideas for Victoria's future, alongside associated sort of draft actions to support the delivery of those big ideas. And so, as Jesse mentioned, lots of that was developed through the thousands of pieces of feedback that was received in the 6 months prior, and conversations with community councils and industry as well. Once submissions closed, we embarked on phase 4, which was engagement through the Victoria's People's Panel, which was a deliberative engagement process where we sent letters out to 20,000 people and to see who was available and interested in writing the vision and participating in this process. Eventually, we ended up selecting 49 people who participated in a number of sessions to review the feedback that we'd received, to hear about the plan, listen to some professionals and expert speakers, and essentially they wrote the vision and the 4-pillar narratives which are in the plan now. Importantly, we've also been engaging with traditional owners and First Peoples across the state. We've travelled across the state to meet with registered Aboriginal parties and First Peoples stakeholder groups, mainly to understand their needs, wants, aspirations, and how they want to be engaged continually on this plan as we sort of drive forward to implement it and generate new actions and ideas. So you can find more information on our detailed process and engagement findings on our website, which has our engagement report. This slide just provides a general snapshot of the feedback received from council. It's very high level, but it sort of just identifies the strong participation we had from councils in providing a written submission on the 8 big ideas in July, August last year. So all metropolitan councils provided a submission, and the majority of regional councils provided a submission on the plan, which was great to have. At a high level, regional councils outlined strong support for a statewide plan to reflect regional differences between regional Victoria and metropolitan Melbourne, an emphasis on having appropriate planning and funding to support services and work that needs to get underway, as well as a high emphasis on public and active transport networks to improve accessibility and connectivity. For metropolitan councils, there was a strong support for changes to the planning system. Again, support for a single statewide plan in this realm, although relating to managing growth, and an emphasis again on proper planning, funding, and the development of community facilities. And lastly, just a focus on livability for current and future residents. Over the next couple of slides, I'll speak to what we heard from councils under each of the 4 pillars which we engaged on. So starting with regional councils, and for the housing pillar, there's a strong support for housing near transport hubs, but funding for public and active transport is needed, and calls for planning policy reviews to boost social and affordable housing, including clear targets. Under equity and jobs, a need for greater public transport investment, higher surface frequency, and better links between jobs and housing. And lastly, under equity and jobs, sorry, previous slide, a recognition that rural communities rely on private vehicles. So not all of regional Victoria has access to good public transport and active transport. So, the need for requiring road network improvements. Next slide, please. Under thriving and livable suburbs and towns, we had support for statewide mapping to protect employment, agriculture, and environmental areas, and calls for more open space funding and a minimum tree canopy target, alongside with strategies for expanding tree canopy cover and education for communities. Under sustainable environments and climate action, support for renewable energy, however, noting concerns about its impact on the environment and agricultural productivity. Next slide, please. This is the feedback that we've at a higher level for metropolitan Melbourne councils. Support for clearer housing diversity targets, including mandatory social and affordable housing targets. So again, this is a repeated theme that we heard under the regional councils. Advocacy for high density housing in activity centres and transport hubs, ensuring that development respects local character. And equity in jobs, support for public and active transport investment, including network upgrades and service frequency. So similar themes emerging from the previous slides. Calls for balancing employment and housing land with potential mandatory employment land targets in activity centres, and an emphasis on inclusive planning that represents all community groups. So with the last two pillars, under thriving and livable suburbs and towns, there was support for planned growth that respects local character and community values, concerns about services and infrastructure lagging behind population growth affecting livability, and recommendations to better utilise public land and waterways to enhance open space and tree canopy cover. Under sustainable environments and climate action, there's strong support for climate action and embedding environmentally sustainable design in the Victorian planning provisions. So I guess just to, how have we used all this feedback? Well, this is just, as I said, a brief snapshot of all the detailed and technical submissions we've received from councils. We've also received a lot of information from industry and community, and this has been used to inform the development of the final housing targets and the development of the final plan itself. So we'll continue to use all of this feedback and information to support the implementation of actions and the development of future actions for future iterations of the plan. I'll now hand over to Lester, who will take us through an overview of the plan.
Thanks, Sam. I'm Lester Townsend. I'm Director of Plan for Victoria. Next slide, please. So you'll see on the front cover of a Plan for Victoria that it's a plan written by Victorians for Victorians, and this is very real proposition. As Sam went through in terms of our processes, we convened a People's Panel through a deliberative engagement process, and the 49 people, and they wrote the People's Panel vision for Victoria, and the commitment is to deliver that vision through the plan and to keep that vision our front and centre of our minds as we deliver the plan. In terms of the plan itself, it includes a vision and objectives for each pillar, details on local government housing targets, the plan on maps, and the actions that bring the plan to life. It's framed around initially around 5 pillars, and then the actions are presented in the appendices that will deliver on those pillars. So self-determination and caring for country, it's underpinning and informing all the other pillars, but also an important set of commitments in its own right. Housings for all Victorians, delivering sufficient affordable homes for all Victorians, accessible jobs and services, making sure you have good access to facilities and good jobs, great places, suburbs and towns, creating thriving places that are attractive, safe and welcoming for everybody, and particularly for children, for more marginalised groups in society, for women, particularly in terms of safety. And sustainable environments, preserving our natural environment of Victoria and addressing climate change. Next slide. A key element of the plan in terms of delivering on those pillars, particularly within the housing space, but overall framing how we develop Victoria into the future, is setting housing targets for each municipality. And they'll play a key role in housing choice and affordability. So we took the 2.24 million homes that were identified in the housing statement, and we distributed those across municipalities across all of Victoria in looking to build homes where there were good access to opportunities and services, the opportunity to deliver homes in those well-located areas. And the aim is to ensure every planning scheme identifies enough realistic opportunities for new development to deliver the target number of homes. So there's been some jurisdictions and some commentary in Victoria about what the targets means. The targets are about adjusting planning schemes so that by 2050 there's a realistic prospect of delivering the homes we need. And certainly if you think about it in theory, every block, every dwelling could have 3 units on it. So Victoria has capacity for, 3 times the population. That's not a useful way of looking at it. What we're looking at is what is the capacity in planning schemes that we think can realistically be delivered to meet the housing targets. And Sam will talk a little bit later at the end about how we will be assessing planning schemes to reach that conclusion, working with local government in terms of zone and overlay changes. Next slide. Part of that process, or within that delivering those housing targets, the state government is not just simply leaving it all up to councils. There is the Active Activity Centre program. So you'll be aware, or many of you will be aware, that there was 10 pilot programs, 10 pilot activity centres as part of a pilot program. We expect the controls for those centres to be gazetted shortly. But the government has also announced another 50 locations, and those locations are in a plan for Victoria. And that program is aimed across the 60 activity centres, encouraging more than 300,000 new homes to be built around Melbourne's train and tram lines, jobs and services. And the plan will guide growth and investment in community facilities. Some of those activity centres are located located around train stations, or many of them, or almost all of them, are located around train stations. And I think in crude terms, we could say the previous policy, certainly in metropolitan Melbourne, was to build homes around the shops and in the paddocks, around activity centres and in the growth areas. There's a clear emphasis in a plan for Victoria and in the activity centre program of building homes around stations, because these are the areas that have a really strong access to public transport. And part of identifying those 60 activity centres was looking at where the capacity in the existing rail and public transport network are. So as you're aware, planning is part of the Department of Transport and Planning, so we worked with our planning colleagues to identify those locations that have good access to public transport so we can maximise the efficient use of existing infrastructure. Next slide, please. So the plan for Victoria presents the plan on maps, an overall framework for Victoria, and then zoomed in on metropolitan Melbourne, also zoomed in on Ballarat, Bendigo and Greater Geelong. So not usefully not a plan for Melbourne stuck with a plan for Victoria, but a plan for overall for Victoria, quite clearly zooming in on metropolitan Melbourne because of the population density of the metropolitan area, but an integrated idea. And part of that integrated idea, as I said, with activity centres in metropolitan Melbourne and in the larger centres, is a change in the hierarchy. Certainly in metropolitan Melbourne, we identify the central city as we have done in the past. We identify metropolitan activity centres as we have done in the past, but also add at that higher level the SRLA stations that will trade off that significant transport investment. But at the next level down, there is a switch to look at what we call housing choice and station activity centres, and these are the locations, 60 of which have been selected as part of the new 50 as part of the activity centre program, but also others which will be led by local government. And these are the preferred locations for housing choice because of their good accessibility. There are some non-station location centres identified, and you'll see those on the plans, and we'll be able to provide a list of those very shortly. And these are the areas that we know have good access to services and appropriate public transport to be good locations for housing growth. And some major activity centres, quite frankly, they're good for services, but they're not necessarily the best locations for more homes. So there's that shift in how we look at activity centres and how we clearly prioritise growth of homes into the locations with good accessibility to transport and services, which won't always be higher level activity centres. Next slide, please. In terms of implementation, the plan presents thinking and maps for each pillar. It's those thinking and that maps is based on what we heard, and then there is implementation action. So what I want to do is just take you through an overview for each pillar and the key actions and a flavour of what those actions will be in terms of how they'll be implemented for each pillar. So housing for all Victorians. This is about providing all Victorians with a choice of well-designed homes at an affordable price close to daily needs. And we certainly heard that Victorians want affordable and diverse houses, that there is a support for more social and affordable housing. We need different types of homes to meet the needs of all communities. There's support to show how areas will grow and change, support for removing minimum parking standards in appropriate locations where people simply don't need a car, and ensuring the design and construction of new apartments is high quality. And so there's 6 key actions aimed at that. Implement the housing targets for every local government area, and you'll be hearing more about that in the coming months, and there's further webinars on our housing capacity tool, and we will be updating the planning policy framework to explicitly include the housing targets that are in a Plan for Victoria in the planning system. And for those of you who have growth areas in your municipality, you'll note that there is a target for the existing area and a target for the greenfield area. And that was in response to explicit feedback we had from those municipalities in our engagement process. We'll implement new planning controls to streamline planning in activity centres. They've already been gazetted in terms of the parent provisions. Those of you may know of these. These are the built form overlay, which is to streamline the implementation of structure plans in the core of activity centres, and the housing choice and transport zone in the periphery. This is to provide a standardised approach to streamline the preparation of activity centre plans or strategic plans. That, coupled with a new zone, the precinct zone, will allow also for the support the planning of suburban rail loop precincts and other priority precincts of government. And some of you may have seen the proposed planning scheme amendments for the suburban rail loop, showing what those schedules to the built form overlay look like. We'll carefully manage the outward sprawl of regional cities and towns. So you'll be aware that there are, in the planning system, there are defined settlement boundaries and the urban growth boundary. The defined settlement boundaries under the Distinctive Area and Landscape part of the Planning and Environment Act. And they are very hard boundaries and require approval of both houses of Parliament to change. There are also a number or many boundaries that are identified in planning policies, in planning schemes, but they are on PDFs within policy. The plan is to bring those up to an explicit layer within VicPlan to make them much more transparent in the system, able to be interrogated from using GIS tools, so that we can manage the outwards growth of cities and ensure that that's appropriate. We'll be preparing a practice note on setting those boundaries, and the processes and the tests for changing those boundaries as we move forward. There's a desire to increase the number of social and affordable homes, noting that there are currently constraints under the Planning Environment Act about what we can mandate in the Victorian jurisdiction, and those issues are currently being considered, among other issues, as part of the Planning and Environment Act review. We'll match car parking and bike parking requirement facilities with demand. So you'll be aware there are two columns in the provisions that relate to parking requirements. At the moment, they are done in terms of a very crude proximity to the principal public transport network. We're looking for a more sophisticated analysis whereby the actual accessibility of those areas measured by PTAL, public transport accessibility level, will guide the number of cars that are needed, noting that spaces are expensive to provide and so forth work against affordability, and it's certainly in many places those car parks lie empty because there's simply not the demand. We'll also update the Better Apartments design standards and the apartment design guidelines for Victoria to provide clearer guidance and around the high density development we expect to be developed over the coming decades. Next slide, please. Accessible jobs and services, enabling you to connect to jobs, education, healthcare, shops, and the services that you need to live a productive and prosperous life. What have we heard? We heard about the need to improve public transport, reduce congestion, enhance biking and walking paths, increase public transport frequency, more investment in road networks, ensure land is available for local industrial and commercial purposes, and fostering community connection through more local services and open space. So we'll improve transport network planning in planning policy. So as I said, we have the principal public transport network as part of the current planning system, but that's no longer up to date and doesn't help us in a sort of more dynamic way to plan for public transport networks. So there's a lot of work being done in the transport space on what a more efficient transport network would look like, but we need to be able to specify that in planning policy and implement it incrementally over time. But also more importantly, when we do the planning for activity centres, those 50 that the state is leading and others that councils might lead, we need to be clear about what public transport services we need to deliver or accommodate within an activity centre area, within a structure plan area. And we need to do that. We need to raise that into a clearer level of planning policy. We need to ensure new industrial and commercial land is ready for development. So we've seen a growth in jobs in Victoria, and that's due through some of our supply of industrial and commercial land. And so we're looking at actions whereby, and those actions have already started, we can unlock that industrial and commercial land. We need to streamline community development infrastructure development contributions, again, work that's already is beginning, and coordinate public infrastructure and service delivery to support more homes. All things which we heard clearly through engagement. Next slide, please. Great places, suburbs and towns, ensuring Victoria's suburbs, towns and neighbourhoods are vibrant, resilient and inclusive to support strong communities. So we heard clearly a focus on greener suburbs with more tree canopies, more walking and bike paths, preserve and enhance open spaces, particularly for children and young people, public spaces to be accessible, inclusive and environmental friendly, improve public transport and offer more active transport services. So we protect and enhance our canopy trees, and we'll be setting a target for 30% tree canopy cover in urban areas. Introduce minimum standards for open space in established areas. We do this quite well in growth areas, but we don't have such a clear articulation of what the open space needs are in these denser areas. So the idea that if you're living in an apartment, you can get out to a bit of green space, maybe catch some sun, relatively close, so more in the pocket park area, and how that might be a different set of standards to greenfield areas. Make the best use of land around train stations. Some of you who've got train stations will know they're often surrounded by car parks or not the most attractive places in the municipality. Certainly through the level crossing removal process, those areas have been dramatically updated, but there's also a balance to think about what might be the best use, and there's examples of what's been done, say at Jules Station, with higher density development around the station, or for many decades now, what's happened at Box Hill with shops around stations. We'll update design guidance to deliver better public places. So we have the urban design guidelines for Victoria. In our engagement with professionals and others, we've found that they don't necessarily feature front and centre. They are also parallel some other guidance that the department has in the movement and place guidance, which planners tend not to be familiar with. We're looking at bringing those pieces of guidance together in a more comprehensive and inspiring way, so that that design guidance can better inform planning decisions, but also educate and inspire the community, developers, local government. We'll encourage walking and cycling, and particularly with actions in an active transport strategy. Next pillar, please. Sustainable environments, protecting our environment and agricultural land and natural resources for sustainable, healthy future. So certainly heard about the need for sustainability. What we'll do will improve the environmental sustainability of development. Better communicate and manage flood, bushfire and climate hazard risks. So some of you will be aware that often modelling is done, but there is a journey between the modelling and the technical understanding of what the risk is into planning schemes. We want to look at how we can get that latest information front and centre in planning decisions without a long-winded process. We'll protect our Birrarung. We recognise in Victoria Birrarung as a Yarra River as a natural living entity, and we're looking at how we can protect our Birrarung better within planning system, but also moving forward looking at how we can protect other rivers and other living entities, natural living entities in our planning system. And we'll protect and carefully use regional resources. So we certainly have a wealth of resources in Victoria. We need to protect our natural resources. We also need to protect things like our extractive industries, which our growth depends on. We need to identify areas for renewable energy. We need to identify transmission path lines. That's work that the government is doing at the moment. We expect to be finalised sometimes this year, and we need to then incorporate that in the planning scheme. Next pillar. Self-determination and caring for country. Registered Aboriginal parties are keen to collaborate. We understand the need for clear communication and the strong relationships, and that we must respect our traditional owners and First Peoples. So we want to make the planning system fairer for traditional owners and First Peoples. In some cases, land has been given over to the management of traditional owners for particular reasons, and then the planning scheme has prohibited that. That just seems a bit silly. We want to address that. We want to embed or provide the opportunity to embed traditional owners' knowledge in the built environment. There's some interesting things that have been done in Geelong about that, so that we have better connection to country, and introduce more traditional owner place names in partnership with traditional owners, and the potential to reflect country in planning schemes. So a number of traditional owner groups have caring for country plans. We think it would be appropriate to include those in the if the traditional owners want, into planning schemes. Next slide, please. Implementation next steps. So there'll be statutory implementation. So we currently have an internal working draft for planning policy framework, which is the sort of the first tranche of the day one. Some of the key highlights of that is we are looking at to introduce an acknowledgement of country into planning schemes, introduce the People's Panel vision that we spoke of earlier, restructured and refined Clause 11, settlement in the first instance to give effect to those housing statements and to implement the vision of a plan for Victoria, and inclusion of framework plans and legends that we saw, so they'll replace the current plans and replace those for Victoria and those the regional growth plans. The housing targets will be actually introduced so that they can guide planning scheme reviews. There'll be the 22 actions. We'll coordinate the delivery of the 22 state-led actions. Each action will have its own project plan and delivery timelines. They're all are short-term. It's really an issue of think in decades, act in years. We have a long-term plan, but our actions are all immediate actions that we know we can get on with. Statutory implementation of some of the relevant actions will occur as part of those action development over the next year. And actions include the implementation of the housing targets, I said, regional growth boundaries and the activity centre program. And it is that living plan. So we will be ongoing monitoring and review and potentially looking at new actions, again, that can be delivered in a relatively tight time frame once we've got the current batch of actions underway. Next slide. So you can look in the implementation plan for a plan for Victoria. It's in the printed version and the online version. You can see what we're doing. We'll be engaging in briefing stakeholders on a plan for Victoria, such as this local government, community, traditional owners and First Peoples. So we've got a number of briefings that we're doing. We'll be amending the planning policy framework, as I said, and the VPP. Some of those changes we expect to see pretty shortly. We'll be developing planning practice notes and guidance materials on housing targets and regional boundaries. And we're looking at preparation of an interactive map online, but also a housing capacity assessment platform, which will allow us to have a common approach to whether planning schemes have enough capacity, and we'll develop those tranche 2 actions. So what I do now is hand back to Sam. Sam will give you some of that overview of the housing target implementation and that capacity tool. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Lester. So a lot of the questions and feedback that have come through the engagement process and program and prior to this session as well is what are we going to do and how are we going to support housing target implementation. So currently the team's developing a number of guidance material in development to support the implementation of the local government housing targets. The package of guidance material will provide greater clarity regarding what will be expected of councils in addressing the housing targets. And this includes the housing capacity assessment platform. More informally, we're calling it the HCAP tool, which will be an online platform looking to provide councils to assist with the calculation of supported housing capacity in planning schemes. Preparing a technical document which will detail the methodology and assumptions that underpin the operation of the housing capacity assessment platform. And finally, an advisory note will be published that will contain information on the purpose, operation and implementation of housing targets in practice. Next slide, please. As was alluded to, so we have a housing capacity assessment platform showcase, which will be running in a couple of weeks, and that's to provide more detail on housing target implementation and in particular this tool that's being developed. The sessions will provide an overview of the tool to support the assessment of local planning scheme housing capacity. It will detail the forward program and the rollout of the platform and provide a more detailed overview of the guidance material that I've just sort of mentioned there. So we have 2 identical sessions being run in a couple of weeks' time, one on Wednesday, the 2nd of April, and second on Thursday, the 3rd of April. So if you haven't received an invitation and would like to attend, please get in contact with us. Alternatively, we'll be endeavouring to record the sessions and provide the relevant slides and links to the presentation as well. Perhaps next slide, please. So that's the end of our formal presentation. Thanks for your attendance and participation this afternoon. Just as a reminder, we will endeavour to distribute the slides, a link to the recording of this presentation, and a response to any questions which we haven't responded to yet or aren't able to respond to as part of this next process. So I'll hand back to Lester, who will run through some of the questions in the Q&A. Thanks,
So
Lester.
I'm looking at the Q&A and I can't see any questions. So, so are there no questions? So
there is Lester. I can perhaps if I read them out to you and Jesse, and you guys can respond to them. Is that okay?
Yeah. For some reason I can't. Mine's not opening either, Zach. So that would be great.
That's all right.
I can see yours, Zach, but nobody else's. Yeah.
That's all right. Excuse the background noise. I'm in the office, guys. But the first question we had here was, is there no longer an activity centre hierarchy? ? Have higher order activity centres been removed? With all activity centres having the same role and function and catchment? Not sure if Lester, you're able to answer that.
I can answer that. So there, no, not all activity centres are the same, and they don't all have the same role, and they don't all have the same catchment. So essentially, there are metropolitan activity centres, and they're at the certainly from talking metropolitan Melbourne, they are at the highest level, and they are large enough to drive the metropolitan structure, like a city of centres or a city of cities approach. So they are the highest level, and there are not many of those, and they are large enough to drive urban structure. One of the issues with the 126 or whatever it is major activity centres we've got, none of them are actually large. That's too many to drive urban structure in terms of accessibility and getting the shift away from private motor vehicles into public transport, which we'll need to do as we densify. We want to try to do that with not really increasing the number of vehicle kilometres. And they will do that by people be able to do trips by other modes, or be able to do shorter trips. So the metropolitan activity centres at the highest level. The next level, if we think about a level, but mainly it's better maybe to think not so much in a hierarchy, but in a typology. The typologies, the activities, housing choice and stations, these are good locations for higher density homes. And because more people will live there, we'll expect there be areas where services are delivered. Yes, there will still be some other activity centres, which are sort of community servicing activity centres, but the primary distinction is not just because you've got some shops, you're an activity centre, doesn't necessarily mean that you are the best place for more homes, particularly when we're looking at the quantum of homes that we need to provide by 2050. So are much more targeted in terms of putting the homes where we need and then providing the services for those homes. But it also, one of the things you'll see in the Plan for Victoria is talk about the access to opportunities and services tool, a livability heat map. Not everything needs to be in an activity centre, and it's not such a strict hierarchy. Think, city's not a tree, it's not such hierarchical, hierarchical tree sort of a thing. Part of the idea is that from your front door, you will have access to the services you need, and that will apply perhaps a more flexible approach in some ways to the way we've handled the provision of services in urban areas.
And Lester, I'd probably add to that, in terms of regional centres, we've also put things under 4 main categories, which is either major regional city, regional service centre, or cross-border city or town. And again, it's recognising that in all your planning schemes, you have various hamlets, villages, you'll have various names for other activity centres, etc. But this was about trying to make that clearer, I suppose, in the sense of what we mean by the services and what role these locations are playing, and in the same way, whether it's metro or regional. So instead of being overcomplicated and trying to fit everything into its own sort of small box, as Lester said, what role do these locations play? And we're focusing on specifically where we're looking to see that, greatest housing density.
Okay, I can see the questions now, so perhaps I can, I'll run through them in the order. From Alison Egan, when can councils expect to see an updated overdue, I'm just reading what Alison said, reformed infrastructure contribution systems to go along with the increased population densities? That's not work that's currently coming out of the Plan for Victoria branch, that's coming out of other parts of government. So I can't answer that. I'm not sure, Jesse, if you're in a position to answer that. That is certainly work that's actively going on. It's an action. It's an action within a Plan for Victoria, but we can't give you the timeframes on that.
Just most broadly, there had been an industry advisory committee that was had findings that were due to be come out to government in March. As to when that's going to be released and what the flow on from that is, we don't know, but that's where that's currently at.
Yeah. Catherine has asked, in terms of open space provision, will public open space contribution requirement be reviewed to apply to developments not being subdivided, build to rent schemes? That is something that we know is an issue. The team will be exploring that, but we're not in position to there's no government position on that issue. Will the from Austin, will the restructured and refined clause 11 affect framework and settlement plans and how they set out at a local level? I'm not sure, Austin, if you're talking about, we'll certainly be removing the regional growth framework plans. They don't seem to do a lot of work within the planning system. There's some, we're still settling the text aspects of those. In terms of eventually, framework plans in clause 2 will need to be adjusted. We see that as part of the rollout and planning scheme review as people implement housing targets over the next year or so in their schemes.
And that may mean that some framework plans that are done are completely fine and don't need to be touched because council's already been able to show that they're planning for that capacity. It's not necessarily that everything will change, but it really comes down to how your council is showing that you're being able to meet your housing targets in terms of planning capacity.
Is it likely to support the implementation of Plan for Victoria that regional plans will be developed to provide more tailored guidance to these areas and informed regional policies? In terms of, no, we're not convinced that ever more plans are required. In fact, some of the material that some of you may have heard, we presented on earlier, but I think there's partly a cultural shift. If you look at our current website, in the planning website, it says planning is about creating plans. I think that's been an attitude in planning. That is not that is not something that our current thinking. Planning is not about creating plans. Planning is getting on with the job. Yeah. It's not clear to us that those ever more finer, detailed regional plans actually help us get on with the job of delivering homes and services to people. Clearly, if there's a need for a plan because there are there is some strategic ambiguity of an area, or we need to make clear the strategic choices in an area, yes, certainly, but not as a sort of like first principle that we just need more plans. How does aiming at 30-degree tree canopy align with the new townhouse and low-rise outcomes and drive for increased densities? The minister's made it very clear in the statement she makes publicly that she's a supporter of targets because they provide a clear direction on what is expected to be achieved. The 30-degree canopy is that clear target because we know that a lot of the health benefits and environmental benefits kick in. How does that all play out with the new townhouse and low-rise code? Part of the answer to that will come with the new design guidelines that are alluded to, that are one of the actions in a Plan for Victoria, people in place looking at what those greening options are. And certainly you can look around Melbourne, you can look around Geelong, you can look at Benalla Main Street and go, geez, you could put a lot more trees in this area and achieve some of that canopy stuff. So there's work being done in remeasuring the canopy cover across Victoria, across Melbourne, and looking at those options. We think that it can be achieved, and we'll be looking more carefully at that. Chris, in the regional context, are the greenfield housing targets aligned with existing zoned land? And if so, does this mean future rezonings are less likely to be supported by DTP on the basis it would compromise the 70-30 or 60-40 targets? There's a lot to unpack in that question, Chris, and there's a lot to unpack depending on the particular regional context, noting that in some regional context, a regional greenfield can trade off the existing area, and so different issues are at play. Also, different land markets are at play in terms of expectations. So that's not a question that we can really sort of give you a quick answer to right now. Melanie, how does this plan tackle underdevelopment in key development areas? Does disincentivize single dwellings in areas close to amenities and services? That's a matter for the planning tools that are applied, Melanie. So that certainly within the built form overlay, there is the ability to set minimum height or minimum floor area ratios to disincentivize that, though noting that VCAT has refused developments over the years on the basis they're under development. In terms of the housing choice and transport zone, I would have to go back and double check the precise requirements on single dwellings on that. I'm not sure where that landed, but I do know that's a discussion that is a live issue. I think there is there's a need to sort of distinguish between housing supply and those incentivifications. I see we're at 2 o'clock, but
yes,
we probably I have a crack quickly at the next couple. Thinking the explaining behind the new zone and overlays instead of utilising the activity centre zone. That's Sarah. That's a whole discussion for a different day, but it's about streamlining the system and making it easier for people to use. Question about funding. We don't control funding. Where can we find more information on ATOS, the planning tool used by DP? Samantha, shoot us an email. We can have a more detailed conversation with you about that. It's a tool in development. We've used it. We're looking at how we can make it more publicly available. Are there changes to protected indwelling occupancy rates? That's a Victorian future issue that comes out of our demographic area. We are working towards the 2.24 million homes. Kim, public and community engagement fund is great. Similar to other questions, I'm wondering where some of the detailed strategic guidance will now come from, if it isn't in that document. We'll continue to engage. Some of it's in Plan for Vic, but a lot of it's in Plan for Vic, but we'll continue to engage. I'm not sure whether we should got time to keep answering, Jesse. Bit in your hands.
It depends if people are happy to stay on the line. We haven't lost many, so just keep going.
Okay. Has there been any thought to integrate transport planning in the regions and whether there will be a service upgrade or extensions of the infrastructure 50-year strategy? That's not something we can answer. We understand the need to provide transport, obviously, to growing areas, and we're looking into how we can much better integrate transport planning and urban planning in general. Dana, what was the criteria for selecting the 60 centres and what was the methodology for establishing the housing targets? So the housing targets were taking the 2.24 million and distributing them with a housing model across across the areas we modelled, looking at the capacity, looking at feasibility, and looking at the transport implications, including FIDM. There's a whole presentation on how we did that, and I think some of that is maybe the video still online. The criteria for selecting the 60 centres was based on they were good locations and there was capacity within the planning network. There was a sort of a ranking of the particular centres that was then considered by government. It's envisaged that additional activity centres will feature in future iterations. Is it envisaged that additional? Potentially not at the metropolitan level. I wouldn't rule it out, but not in the near future. But certainly, I expect there'll be shifting around as we work through housing capacity targets of new activity centres coming through. So it's not a question of these as the activity centres hierarchy we've got, we're going to protect it. We'll be looking, as we should as planners should be looking at where do we need services to serve our growing populations. Why is there such a disparity between BIF population forecasts, historical construction rates in housing targets? I'm not sure there is such a disparity, Joel, but that can get very technical very quickly, so I want to pass over that, but we're happy to have those chats with you in the future. Jennifer, I appreciate your desire to keep the plan flexible instead of fixed. However, there's a lot more information across a lot of web pages at the moment. Is there a plan to create an overarching website similar to Port Phillip Western Port Regional Catchment Strategy to have a central? We do have it an online version, so I'm not sure whether, Jennifer, you've had a look at that or whether you've had a look at that and found it wanting. But the expectation is that it will be an overarching website. Well, certainly part of the planning website. The government's quite clearly, they like to, obviously we need to manage websites across government in total, and so we are part of the planning website. Is there no longer this Alanya activity centre hierarchy? Have higher order centres been removed? We've addressed that. I think it was the first one. I've got to the end, I think, Zach.
Okay. Is that right, Zach? That's the end.
Oh, there's a few new questions that have come up to the top of the chat if you wanted to tackle more.
Oh yeah, okay.
Lesser, but
no,
they just keep coming.
Are there plans to review and provide guidance to other parts of the planning policy framework to make planning for housing challenging, such as clause 1302? I have to take that on notice. I can't recall offhand what clause 1302 is, but yeah, I think part of the emphasis or part of it as a living plan is to use the planning policy framework and to, we are looking to put the plan in the planning policy framework, in a sense immediately, from a government perspective. Now I'm just tongue in cheek. Look, we will be implementing in the PPF in the next month. Compared to, I think 18 months for Plan Melbourne and about 3 or 4 years for Melbourne 2030. We are very focused on getting it into the planning system and using and to be able to adjust the PPF as we move forward. Would be great if TTP could have a regular general forums on PPF with local government. That's a great idea. Thanks, Tracy. We'll consider that. Jorg, will DTP continue to support councils in retaining employment precinct land in the face of? Yes, we will. Those policies remain unchanged, except potentially with some adjustments in SRL precincts where we're spending a lot of money providing some very high quality public transport, and we might look to higher employment uses, but essentially has targets for Plan Vic considered the most recent flood mapping? We have considered the most recent flood mapping, noting though that's a moving space, particularly with Melbourne Water rolling out new mapping over the next couple of years. Is there a time frame? Sorry, this is from Rick. Is there a time frame for when councils have a clear idea about the new open space targets and guidelines and other Plan for Vic actions to support this planning work with community visions and council plans? Look, we're looking to have that work, Rick, done within the next 6 months or so. But we still haven't settled all the timelines precisely on all our actions, but we'll be looking to move as quickly as we can. But as I say, it's really that open space stuff is around the fine-grained, more in a structure planning level, not at a high level about how many sports fields do you need for a particular population. It's really about that pocket park connection and some of that larger need to support open space will remain as you currently do it, but what you will have now is the housing target that you'll be working to deliver that. Preferred zone tool for activity centres, Karen Bailey, the standard zone. First port of call, standard zone. If you can use a standard zone, use the standard zone, use it in combination with the built form overlay. The precinct zone will allow you to apply a standard zone and vary it. That would probably be the second choice. A bespoke table of land uses for those who work in the space can be a nightmare to draft, nightmare to manage. So preferred zone, standard zone where possible. Rick, are there certain expectations for how council should plan housing choice and station activity centres that are not part of the state's activity centre plan? Are there new planning practice notes or guidelines is expected at HTC? Let's have a chat about that when we're working through how your council will deliver on its housing targets, but certainly those tools of the housing choice and transport zone and the built form overlay over standard zones is available to councils, and yes, that's what we expect. What's the future for planning practice note 1991 on housing strategy and integrating housing strategies with neighbourhood character? Will these be replaced, updated to reflect changes? Yes, Elsie, they will be. In the immediate term, we expect to put a stamp on them under review, but they will be updated. Linker, for those councils meeting or exceeding their housing targets, how should social and affordable housing target be considered? So the housing target in Plan for Vic is a capacity target. The social and affordable housing target that we may set, that we're considering setting, would be a percentage of homes delivered. Will there be a preference to install? We are looking at the options around that, what that means. Certainly social and affordable housing targets are likely to vary geographically across the state. What's considered to be the key barriers and considerations to implementing a social and affordable housing target? There are legislative issues at the moment, Linker. There is no power within the Planning Environment Act to mandate. So there's certainly that's how to implement a target. Certainly you can set a target, but either the government needs the cash to build them, or in terms of a development contribution approach, if that is thought to be a good idea. There's not a head of power at the moment in the Victorian system. Plan for Victoria shows Cobblebank Major Activity Centre as having no health precinct role, despite the site being okay. Well, Timothy, we better look into that. Cobblebank, I'll get the team. I'll get the team to review that, and we'll reach out to you. It's a living plan, so we may need to adjust that. Are we saying the existing extent of the UGB will remain, or are you suggesting that this could be subject to change? I am not suggesting the UGB should be subject to change. I understand there is no government policy to change it, and my understanding of what lies out the side of the UGB is essentially undevelopable land, and certainly not any vast amount that would give you decades of supply for Melbourne. Will questions submitted on registration be covered, or do we need to resubmit here? I think, no, don't resubmit because I'm running out of puff. And then I'm back to Alison's question. Yep.
Okay, well done, Lister. Thank you. Please feel free to reach out to any of us, though, individually or to the Plan for Victoria mailbox. It's whatever's most comfortable. And as I said, we will close out any other questions that we'd had received ahead of the session as well. So thank you everybody for your time today. It's much appreciated. And yes, thank you. I'll end the meeting there. Thanks.